Hi, we want to thank Rabbi Weisblum for the chance to present this tribute and memory to the Gluskin Yechuzin, and to Rabbi Serebryanski, who made the trip to share with us his tremendous knowledge on this subject. The book is dedicated to my daughter, Ruth. HaSefer Hazeh Niktav Bishvil Levarech et Biti Ruth Bat Yehudah HaLevy. Legadol Batorah Lehegia Lechuppah ולעשות גמילות חסדים. כתבתי זאת כדי שתדעי מהיכן את, שמשפחה יהודים חסידים גדולים, קדושים בתורה, וטהורים, בכירים וזוהרים כמו הרקיע. השמיים מספרים על כבוד כל. כמו שאמר הבעל שם טוב, the best, בזיכרון יש גאולה, כי בזיכרון יש סוד הגאולה השלמה. אבא אוהב אותך מאוד. And as a tag wrap up, let us just say, in the memory of Yehudah ben Tema from the Mishnah, Hayu al Nemer v'kol nesher Rat kitzvi v'gibor ke'aryeh la'asot ritzon avich shebashamayim. And as with this, I turn over the video to Rabbi Serebryanski.
Shalom, shalom. Today, Hayom, we are speaking about Mishpachat Gluskin. Mishpachat Gluskin זה משפחה כמו הרבה משפחות שהשם המשפחה בא מסיבה של משהו ביורופ. In the time of the Tsar, there in Russia, when you had kings, there was a decree that if you had one child in a family, the child was patur, was free from being called up to the army, didn't have to serve in the army. And so many mishpachot, harbe mishpachot, they gave every child a different family name. V'chol yeled haya shem mishpacha shoneh. And so the same thing is with the town of Gluskin. The mishpacha were rabbanim in the town of Lusk or Glusk. In Russia, the Hey and the Gimel, or the H and the G interchange, and so the town of Glusk was called Halusk, or the name Gluskin is also Haluskin. And one child was Margolis, one child was Margolin, and one child was Gluskin. And that's where the name of the family came from. That's how it started. But the mishpacha was not just the mishpacha of Rabbanim in Glus, the mishpacha Dora Dorot of Rabbanim going back for many years. And in the introduction of a sefer that Moshe Zev Gluskin wrote, there's no family name in his sefarim, he just writes Moshe Zev. He didn't like titles either. There he writes what his father told him, Ben Achaben, who they were, and it goes back to a grandson of the Maral of Prague. And there he writes Shamati mi Avi, and then he writes he was a grandson of the Maral. It's in the middle. It's I don't know where he told him to where. If he told him just to the grandson, or he told him the grandson's a grandson of the Maral, I don't know exactly because it's in the middle, but at any rate, they go back to the Maral, Yosef Yitzchok. And at that point, the family's name was Saba. How did it become Margolis? Because at one time, Menachem Mendel married someone who came from the family of Margolis, and he took on his wife's Shem HaMishpacha. The name Margolis is also the name of a woman and her mishpacha. If you go back over 600 years, Rabbi Yaakov, who was the Rav Harashi in Nirburg, he named his family Shem Mishpacha after his mother. His father was Moshe Marmunda from Livorno, and the mother was Margola, and so because for whatever reason he named his family Margolis. And fascinating enough, one from his family grandchildren, one of them had 8 sons, and they all took on the name Margolis instead of whatever other name they had, in honor of the family Margolis. So it started with the name of a woman, and there were men who took it over, and then it was taken over, someone married in, and he took over his wife's family name. And fascinating enough, Aaron Gluskin had many daughters and only one son. One son was Menachem Mendel Gluskin of Minsk, and he only had daughters. So his grandson also took on the name Gluskin in honor of his mother's family. So we see in this case a lot of times the family name was not from the father but was from the mother. Although from Moshe Zev Gluskin, who was in Slutsk, his father's name was Gluskin, but people in the town didn't know that because his mother used to run a store in the town, I guess a grocery store, and everyone knew her. So they knew the family on her name, but not on his name. So there's a lot of interesting things when you go to family names and researching. It's not always the men. Anyway, how am I part of the Gluskin family? My father's mother was Nechama Gluskin. She was a sister of Menachem Mendel of Gluskin, Menachem Mendel Gluskin, who was a Rav in Parich and a Rav later on became the Rav Rashi in Minsk. Her father's name was Aaron, who they called Ora as a nickname. He was the Memala Mokim of Reb Hillel in Parich, and his father was Yeshua Gluskin. Yeshua Gluskin was also for a period of time in Shklov. How do I know he was in Shklov? Because in the Beis HaKvaros there is a matzeva of his son that passed away, probably young. But they go back, Yeshua's wife was Gita, whose father was Don Slonim, who was from Ashkenazi, Chassid of the Alter Rebbe. And they go back to a very interesting story. They go back many generations, Rabbanim after Rabbanim. They go back to a town in Rajini where in the Tach V'Tat, a few years after, in that town, they blamed the Jews for killing a Jewish child. They said they're going to kill the whole Jewish community unless the community gives whoever killed them. And so 2 people gave themselves up. And one was Yisrael, who from him Gita Gluskin came from. And when they killed these 2 Jews instead of killing the whole town, and so the Jews made a day of Tainus, as well as they wrote Slichas in honor, and they wrote their Yichas, which went back to Rashi. And so there's Rashi on that side, there's Rabbanim on the other side. From all sides, Rabbanim related to many Rabbanim going through the hundreds of years. And many of them are mentioned, some of them mentioned in the book. Now, it's interesting that this Emmanuel Gluskin, the grandson of Menachem Mendel Gluskin, who was the chief rabbi in Minsk, he took on his mother's maiden name, Gluskin, and he now lives in Kfar Saba. So he's gone back to where the family name is Saba. So it's interesting how history goes back and turns. There is some information on the family, on the connection to Moshe Zev Gluskin, mentioned in Kovetz Al Yad, which was printed in Europe and then reprinted in Israel. And we'll speak a little bit about the Gluskin family. Although there's a lot we can go into the history and the interesting details of the family, the main thing I'll focus on a period of the Gluskin family where it was called Gluskin. Moshe Zev was about 30 years old when the Vilna Gaon passed away, and when he went to Vilna, he was a Yotze v'nichnas to the Vilna Gaon. He was a Gaon Olam, and Rabbi Kiva Eger writes to him that he's a Nezi Yisrael and a Gaon Olam as well. And Reb Chaim of Volozhin used to discuss with him all the issues he had with chinuch, with his yeshiva, with Inyanim HaKlalim, everything. He used to discuss with him a lot of things. And when there were two different stories where the Gluskin family was passing by the town, and Reb Chaim heard they're passing by, they were going by, they didn't have time to come in. He went out of the town to meet them and spend time with them. So you see that he attributed to them a tremendous respect. Menachem Mendel is actually the name of Menachem Mendel of Gluskin, who was the Rav Harashi in Minsk. And he said that the name Mendel was a name that came from the Anusim from Spain. There are people who say Mendel was from Man or from Mandlach or from Mendez, a Spanish name, but he didn't. He said it wasn't. That's not what it was. He claims that it was. Let's see if I have it. He says it came from the name Emmanuel. People used to call people Manuel instead of Emmanuel, and from Manuel became Mendel. That's how it transferred, and it came from the Anusim, and that's where Menachem Mendel came from. And it's interesting that on his letterhead, as Rav Harashi in Minsk, he only writes Menachem Gluskin, doesn't put the name Mendel in. I never asked him why, but it's interesting. So there are a lot of historical, interesting things about it. And there are a lot of issues that went on in Russia. Menachem Mendel Gluskin's father was Aaron. His grandfather was Yeshua. Yeshua was a Rav in Loyev. You heard of the Levy and Rabbi. It's interesting that Menachem Nochem of Chernobyl went there specifically so his grandson should be a Rav there, become a Rebbe there. But the town took this Gluskin to be a Rav. He was a Chabad Chassid, and he became Rav there. And while he was Rav, all different other people were there, but no one could be in that place. The same thing in a similar vein happened with his son, Aaron Gluskin, who became Rav in Parish after Rabbi Hillel. There were people, the son of the Ritzitzer Rebbe, of the Kapusta Rebbe, wanted to be Rav there. They didn't accept him. They didn't accept anyone else. They took Aaron Gluskin. And what happened was Aaron did not want to become a Rebbe. They asked him to become a Rebbe, he said no. And then, about close to a year after Rabbi Hillel passed away, he was in business and he lost everything in the business. There was a big fire in his house. He lost everything. And he said, it looks like Rabbi Hillel wants me to become Rav. So he went to Rabbi Hillel's kever and he spoke with him. The family says that he mastered on Rabbi Hillel. He mastered on what happened to him. But I asked my Zayda if he spoke with the Shamas, and he said possibly. And it's possible he asked Rabbi Hillel, and then he became Rav there. So the town didn't want to accept any of the other Gedolim at the time. So both in Loyev And in Paritch, where the Gluskins became Rabbanim, there were other big sons of other rabbis who wanted to become Rabbanim, and they weren't accepted, only the Gluskins. So that is a very interesting element. In fact, my Zayda was in Brahin, and Nechama was a Gluskin. She was the mother there. In their house, when the Chernobyl Rebbes would come visit the town of Brian, they would stay at their house. So there's a lot of background there. But there were also, with Aaron Gluskin, who was Mendel's father, there were a number of interesting stories where people came, Baladin came, to whatever issues they had, and one of them gave a tikiyas kaf or something, and then the other person had to come to collect the money. The guy didn't agree to it, so Aaron said, since you gave tikiyas kaf and you're not doing what you said, you won't have use of your hand. And within a month his hand dried up, and for the rest of his life he could never use the hand. So there were people that were Baal Moshe. Moshe Zev was also, they had, in his town there was a person who was a Moser, and they said to him, what should we do? So Moshe Zev said, bring him to me. They brought him in, and Moshe Zev looked at him. He didn't say anything, he just looked at him, and then he said, you can go. And the guy went to the restaurant to eat, and he choked and he died. And there were a number of such stories with the Moshe where he looked at people, and whatever happened, they didn't last. And the same thing with Rabbanim. So there were people who were Baal Moshe as well. But the most interesting thing, which we're going to, is I guess to Menachem Mendel Gluskin, who is David Levy's great-great-grandfather, my great-great-grandfather, great-uncle, where he became Rav in Paritch after his father passed away. And he married a granddaughter of the Godel of Minsk. Godel of Minsk was not a chassid, and neither was his son-in-law Rabinovich, but he married the granddaughter, and so he was a chassid among people who were not chassidim, but they had a lot of respect for him. He was a genius as a child. As he was growing up, he learned math, science, he learned all different things. He went to the university to get tested, and he couldn't be tested on mathematics because it was Shabbos, so he didn't get his degree in math, but he was very conversant with everything else that was going on around Russian literature and all different elements of understanding the creation of Hashem, which he used. So they grew up in a time where there were pogroms. They grew up in a time where there were very many difficulties. So when the Soviets took over, he continued helping people. But at the time, not only did he help people, the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe, Rabbi Yosef Yitzchok Serebryanski, starting with his father, the Rashab, before he passed away, they created a group of people to help Jews in Russia. It was still during the First World War. And Reb Menachem Mendel was then Rav in Paritch, and he was brought in to be part of the group of helping the Jewish people in Russia. Being in the Igros Kodesh of the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe, you'll find several different letters where he's mentioned as being part of a kvutza of Rabbanim. At that time, it was just helping people. He was in Paritch. But not only was in Paritch, it was interesting that being in Paritch, he was also became Rav of Perluki. He also helped with in Babreisk, when the Rabbanim gave smicha to people. He was part of the Beis Din there as well for things that he was also signed on different smicha documents for people in Babreisk. So he helped the Bata Din around. He was a Rav in many areas around, not just in Paritch. So later on, when he came to Minsk, he became the Minsk because his father-in-law passed away, and his father-in-law was the Rav Roshi Minsk. He was the son-in-law of the Gadol of Minsk. So they said, in order to become the Rav Roshi, you have to marry the daughter. You have to be a son-in-law, not a son. At any rate, he took over in a time in 1924 when the communists were in power, and there were a lot of problems. At different points, the Evsekti or the Enkavedeh or the Gapaod, the Russian police, the secret police, created problems, whether they instigated pogroms, where they arrested Rabbanim and Shoftim. They did many different things to destroy the religion. And in Russia, as you know, it was actually Jewish people involved in these groups who knew about Yiddishkeit, and they knew what to destroy and how to go after Jews. So it was very difficult. And in this, he became a shining star. When the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe left Russia, he ostensibly was in charge of most of what happened, of disseminating money and help to Jews around Russia. There were many other people involved in different ways. They had chadorim, underground yeshivas in different places, and that's already been written up a bit. But with Menachem Mendel Gluskin, his disseminating money and matzahs and everything he did, not a lot has been written, but he kind of took over from the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe in running a lot of things in Russia. And because you couldn't write openly and be open about things, everything was done in a very secretive way, and he was actually very good in doing things in a secretive way. One of the things that is actually very difficult and troubling is that after Rabbi Gluskin died, all his kisvei yad, everything he had, there was in a box, and he went actually in 1934. He became the Rav Roshi in Minsk. In Leningrad? How did it happen? Because in Minsk, what they did is the house that he was in, they split it up. They put in other families there. So the non-Jewish family liked, although they were goyim, they liked what they were doing and started copying what they did on Shabbos. But they split it up. And then the government threw them out of the house. The night before, the day before they were thrown out of the house, Menachem Mendel Gluskin's wife passed away. She died from a lung sickness. So he never told her about it, so she didn't know, and then they threw them out. And so they ended up being in what is the cold shul. And next to the shul, there was the old building, which used to be, actually was the women's section, the old women's section. It didn't have doors, so in winter was freezing, and that's where they ended up. And that was a whole parsha of its own. And from there, what happened was in Leningrad, they needed a chief rabbi. Whatever the Soviets did there to the previous chief rabbi, they needed a new chief rabbi, and the government told them they need to get a rabbi. So they were looking around. They decided to bring Rabbi Gluskin from Minsk. So he left Minsk and he became the chief rabbi in Leningrad, or now St. Petersburg. He was there for 3 years and then passed away. But all his ksavim which he had were in a box. And during the siege of Leningrad, his daughters had to all flee. They left, and the things were left in their apartment. And so the other people that lived there, they took everything that was burnable and burnt everything for warmth, and they burnt everything he wrote as well. So we didn't have that. We don't have that. So we're very lucky that there are a few places where you have his handwriting. For example, on a smicha that he gave, that's a smicha of Rabbanos. You have two of them where you see his handwriting, very clear writing from a person that's writing with clarity. And that's very important, because you can read and learn a lot of things from a person from their handwriting. So it's actually beautiful that we have some of it, even though everything that he wrote was lost. but the handwriting tells you about the way he thought, about his emotions, a lot about him that he wrote with such clarity. He was a person who was very particular about everything. He made sure his daughters made their bed in the morning when they got up. He would make sure he would learn, and he would get up every now and straighten his back. The girls wrote that once they went to a doctor, had to wait. There were benches there, and they lay down with their backs on the bench to keep their back straight. He used to have a handkerchief. He had a running nose, so he had a handkerchief that he used, and he'd actually rinse it out before he put it in the wash. He was very particular about everything he did, and he was particular with people also. He gave out matzahs for Pesach, so there was someone who came in who they don't keep Pesach, they don't keep kashrus, but he gave them matzah, and so his daughter said, "Why do you give them matzah? They eat tarfus. They don't keep Pesach anyway." He said, because while they're eating matzah, they won't be eating something else. And he always he taught them to look at the positive in everything, in everyone and everything. And that's what helped him actually survive through all the Soviet hardships and the difficulties and problems, is because he always looked for first thing for the positive in everything. Yes, there are other sides to things, but first you look for the positive. Once you look for the positive, then you look to balance it. It's like a person has an open heart. If you're open, at some point you're going to get hurt. Someone's going to take advantage. But first you have to have an open heart, and then you have to look for the balance. You don't start with the blockage and then open up. So he always started with opening, and how do we help people? How do we do it? And that's how he got beyond everything, beyond all the issues that went on, as difficult as they were. Another interesting thing was when they arrested in Minsk, they arrested the Shachtim and Rabbanim, and here are two pages from in the 1930s from the Morgan Journal and the Tagblatt, which they describe how the Soviets arrested everyone. And in the first instance, it wasn't really much against him. It was more the Shachtim and other people. He was just happened to be included in it, and they made a play actually about it in the town of making, I guess, fun of the Judaism, or they made a play about it, which they included him as well. But it wasn't really much about him. But later on, the second arrest, they wanted someone else to write that the Russian government, they wanted everyone to sign that the Russian government is being good to Jews and helping Jews, and he wouldn't sign. And they told someone else to sign. They said, I'm not signing unless you release the rabbi first. So, but in the end, they let everyone go. But it was only part of the persecutions that went on. There are many details of how he helped people and what he did, and a lot of them were with people individually. So when people outside Russia heard what was going on, a lot of people wanted to help him. The previous Lubavitcher Rebbe wrote a letter after this that how pained he is by what's happening, and he sent papers. He got everything ready for Rabbi Gluskin to come out of Russia to help him, but Rabbi Gluskin didn't want to leave. He didn't want to leave the people that he was helping, even though he knew how dangerous it was. But he couldn't leave. It was his flock, it was his responsibility, and he couldn't leave responsibility. And there was a question of a big shul in Boston. They wanted a Rav, and the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe wrote in his Igros, it's printed, that he doesn't know any Rabbanim in America who are good enough for it, but he knows two Rabbanim in Russia, one Rabbi Levy Yitzchok Serebryanski and one Rabbi Nachman of Gluskin. Rabbi Levy Yitzchok Serebryanski was the father of the Lubavitcher Rebbe. He says these are only two Rabbanim he knows that are worthy enough to take the position of Rabbanis in Boston. So you see who he compares him with, you can understand his greatness. I'm going to a few different places. because there's a lot of details all over the place, and organizing them is quite a trip. But when he got married to his wife, she spoke French. And so he learned French to speak with her French, so when he didn't want the children to know anything, they spoke in French. Small things like this, but this makes them a family, normal people. He wasn't just a Rav who was in the clouds, or someone who was spiritual, or someone who was into books. He was a person who was very practical, who related to the world around him, and as well as to the world of Rabbanis. Reb Shlomo Chaim Perlov, who was a son of the Mishmer Shalom, was a Rav in Brian. He used to ride back and forth in Yonei Ishas, in Yonei Gittin, in Yonei of all different things that had to deal with Rabbanis. People used to come from all over. There was actually an interesting story, a famous Rav. I put it in the book, but I'm not going to say it on video. But he came to visit him for whatever reason. He was there, and Menachem Mendel had to leave the room. He went out for a while, and while he was gone, a woman came in with a shaila with a chicken. She came in, and there was a guy of Slushitz who later on moved to Eretz Yisrael. He was there. He was teaching him, training him to be a Rav. And when she brought in the chicken, the other Rav looked and said, "It's nothing." So, okay. The woman stayed there, and the Rav left. Why did the woman stay? She said, "You're very good, but I want to ask my rabbi." And the other Rav had to leave. So the other Rav left, and then Rabbi Menachem Mendel came in. He looked at the chicken and started pacing back and forth in the room. Back and forth thinking. He finally said, "It's kosher, you can go." When she left, the young rabbi who was doing shimush by him said, "I see you had a problem making it kosher." He said, "In truth, it's not kosher." It was treif. He said, "But I knew that if that rabbi would find out that he made a mistake, his face would drain, he'd feel weak, he would stop learning. And to shame someone is like killing someone." I said, if I were going to say this, it's called Hafsid Merubah. And Hafsid Merubah, I can say it's kosher. So I told her it's kosher. So, in other words, he thought about other people. He didn't just think about the chicken or about being right. He wasn't about being right, he was about doing the right thing in each situation. And he looked at each situation individually and was able to relate to it. And in general, one of the beautiful things was a lot of people are involved in pilpul back and forth, trying to understand things. He was kalei el shaira. He went to the point, and he understood things the way they were, whether in halacha or whether in life. Anyway, he helped. After his wife passed away, he helped raise his daughters. And another interesting thing was that year of Avelis, he didn't have any sons. He told his daughter, Gitta, the youngest daughter, because the others were involved elsewhere, that she should come to shul every day and say Kaddish. So every day, Gitta came to the shul, stood next to the chazan in the men's section and said Kaddish for a whole year. So here's a frum Rav telling a woman to say Kaddish in the men's section. Wonderful. Now, what happened was, at the end of the year, the last day, she was playing with her friends, and she forgot. And she realized it's late, and she ran to the shul, that's for the last Kaddish, and it was dark in the shul, and only her father and two other people were there, and she came in realizing that she just started saying Kaddish. What's meaning, 3 people? And the father just stood there crying. Anyway, so after her father passed away in Leningrad, that's a number of years later, she also went to the shul to say Kaddish. And there, the Gabbai told her, "Sorry, you can't say Kaddish. Someone else has to say Kaddish instead of you. There's already a different perspective." He says, "You're older now, you can't do it." But there is, I've known several different Rabbanim who have and it's nothing wrong with halakhically for a woman to say Kaddish. And if she has an ability to say Kaddish, if there's a minyan in the house for a month, or say in the women's section, a woman can say Kaddish without any problem if there's no male children. So, again, another example of where he was very open, even though he knew halacha well, he was very open to what halacha wants and where not. So, coming back, I look at my family, my father, my Zayda, his mother, the little bit I know. Of course, my Zayda came from Russia, and my father, they lived in communist Russia, is from Yidden, and I try to understand about the family, the emotions, the thoughts, the feelings that came through generation after generation. And by researching, it enabled me to understand better where my family comes from, where the different reactions and actions and thoughts and perspectives come from. Just want to mention another thing. Menachem and Gluskin had 4 daughters. One of them was buried somewhere in America, and no one knew where she was buried, and I didn't know either. So I finally found the Chevra Kedisha that I thought had buried her, and I found out from someone in the Chevra Kedisha where they have the plot for that Chevra Kedisha in Staten Island, and I went to the cemetery, and I went there and I asked them to look up in their files in the plot where it is, and after looking through, we found where Esther Gluskin is buried, and I was able to take a picture and I put it in the book. It took a little bit of questioning. So when you research, you have to research Vatikaris, which I found a number of names. I found in Loyev there's only 3. They cleared the whole cemetery from all the stones, but there's one left there, which is a Gluskin. I found the Gluskin in Shklov. So looking at cemeteries is very important. Looking actually in newspapers, old Russian newspapers, there are things also you can find from those areas, because they would mention the businesses of people or things. Yeah, but that in Loyev, all you have is the gates there, because the cemetery has been cleared of most of them. But the one that's left there, one of the 3 gravestones are there. One is a Gluskin. So there, I looked through sefarim. One of the places I found a number of names in the back of sefarim. They would have people from towns or villages who would give money or say they were going to buy a sefer, and they have the names in the back of the sefer, and there you have names. An interesting place, Ha'ach, from 1911 to 1915 in Lubavitch, they printed a children's magazine, a weekly that they sent around to many towns to the children, and they had lists of children in different cities and towns, so there you can find names. A lot of places have been destroyed, so researching names is very difficult, researching families is difficult, but if you're persistent and you look, you can find things. Whether it's people's stories, family stories, whether it's in sefarim, especially in this case where it's a Rabbanisha family for many generations, you look at the sefarim they wrote and the things they wrote, the perspectives. There's a lot you can glean, and a lot. It took a lot of time and a lot of research, and for days, sometimes I didn't find anything, I never knew, and suddenly I found one thing here, and with time, things started coming together from all the places. I'm not finished with it, there's a lot more, but at least we were able to put a book together, which this book at least gives a foundation for future generations to do research or to know where they come from. So one of the things you find when you start going back is that actually all Jewish families are related. We're all cousins to each other. We're all one. We come from one place. So the further you go back, the bigger your family tree is, and the more you know that you really need to hug everyone because they're your family and not think about all the other issues.
Thank you, Rabbi Serebryanski, for that wonderful recap of the Gluskin Yochazin, of which, Ruth, you are a Enikla of, and I hope you'll have a sense of not only pride, but you'll know where you're going by looking where you've been. In the book, there's a long essay on the importance of genealogical research, and I hope some of that will be taken and sublimated as a part of who you are as you walk and proceed in your journey in life, because again, you come from Gidolei Torah, Kiddushim Torim, Kazor Akiyah, Zechron Yesh Gula, and in this remembrance of our family, soul sparks, if you will, I'm going to put on the docket a remark of Rabbi Chaim Vital about the importance of genealogical research. Rabbi Chaim Vital, who was the Talmud Muvchak of Ha'aria Kodesh in Tzfat, he wrote a work called Sefer HaChezionot, which is an autobiographical tracing of his soul spark, that is, his genealogy, his yechuzin, and he believed he was making a tikkun for somebody in a previous generation. But he cites his teacher, Ha'aria Kodesh, the same cemetery around where I will be buried, and this is what he cites from Rabbi Isaac Luria. Another reason for the importance of recognizing one's soul ancestry has to do with Ha'ari's doctrine of soul roots, Nishamot Shel Shorashim. This teaching posits that each soul is an intrinsic part of a larger constellation. He's using a stellar metaphor of souls that share a common root, shorish, in Adam Rishon's original soul. These soul roots and soul families have special correspondence and affinity for each other, and even have a kind of responsibility for each other. The knowledge of one's soul ancestry, which Rabbi Serebryanski and I have tried to provide for you, knowledge is what Ha'ari, my teacher, says was able to give to his disciples as a matter of redemption. This familiar relationship of souls to each other serves as a fundamental basis for the Lurianic practice of Yehudim, or unifications, which sought to establish contemplative communion with the soul of a righteous member of one's own soul ancestry through performing specialized meditations in their name and in their memory. And Rabbi Chaim Vital, in the name of his teacher, goes on and relates this aspect of Ibor, because you understand, Ha'aria Kodesh would go to the kever of the Rashbi in Maron and prostrate on the kever of the Rashbi and create theurgic cosmic unifications that would affect things in reality, whether it be parnasa, whether it be finding a shidduch. It actually had theurgic power. And he speaks, Ha'aria Kodesh, as we have it down through Rabbi Chaim Vital, of the ultimate soul root. And knowing one's tree of souls is a revelation, attaining a clear picture of how the system of soul evolution works, practicing cosmic theurgic Yehudim, in addition to the personal memory of the soul, is something that brings redemption through the practice of the act itself of memory that makes a tikkun. So this book is not just an academic game with words. This is our gift to you, Ruth, that you should know where you come from. You come from good Yiddish stock of a rabbinic dynasty and great women as well. And that's why I'm going to wrap up after I give a brief description of some of these PowerPoints that I presented at an AJL conference. Here we have on the front the book jacket of various individuals. If we could have focus on this, that would be great with the video. You see in the middle is Rabbi Chaim Serebryanski, Rabbi Yosef Serebryanski's father. You have various people around the picture, including my grandfather, Rabbi Yosef Yitzchok Serebryanski. And basically, here's how we hunted down in the genealogy of Shklov, very illustrious ancestors. Rabbi Moshe Zev Gluskin, born in 1767, 67, is the son of Rabbi Eliezer Gluskin of Halusk. And Rabbi Eliezer Gluskin of Halusk was admired and honored and regarded by Chaim of Volozhin, as you heard from Rabbi Serebryansky. There's a picture of Rabbi Chaim of Volozhin, known as the Netziv. When visiting Vilna, Moshe Zev would visit the Gra, as you heard from Rabbi Serebryansky, to discuss Torah, and was a cousin of Rab Menachem Mendel of Shklov, a Talmud of Moshe Zev, So a Talmud of Rav Menachem Mendel Shklov, son of Bruch ben Det, a Talmud of the Gra, was a Magid of Flusk, where Rav Eliezer was Abed Din, and Moshe Zev was the first cousin, as they both came from Rabbi Yehudah Yiddel of Kavli. And here's a mask of Flusk below. You see the Gra's picture that we're referring to. Rabbi Chaim of Volozhin admired Rabbi Moshe's father, Rabbi Eliezer of Lusk, as a Godol, and referred to Moshe Zev's Sefer Marot HaTzavos as Hu Sefer Mechubad Levinim. Leah, the wife of Yosef, brother of the Netziv, was the granddaughter of the sister of Moshe Zev's father, Rabbi Eliezer of Lusk. Here's a picture of that book. Now, this is an important slide. Rabbi Serebryanski bought this, I think, at an auction. This is a picture of Rabbi Moshe Zev Gluskin, who was head of the Vintners Association in Israel and did a lot for the development of wine production in Eretz Yisrael. Here he's sitting in his library in Eretz Yisrael. Beautiful picture, very rare picture. Here we have Rabbi Aaron Gluskin of Parich. As you know, Rabbi Aaron Gluskin of Parich followed after Rabbi Hillel Parich, was the father of Rabbi Menachem Mendel Gluskin, and David Levy's great-grandmother, Kayla Liba Gluskin, Helfgott. So Rabbi Aaron received smicha from the Tzemach Tzedek. Here you see a work, Miracles of the Pomegranate, which is done by Hillel of Parich. Here you have a picture of Rabbi Menachem Mendel Gluskin. It's a long story about his kever. He was the younger brother of my great-grandmother, Kayla Liba Gluskin. A picture of the Frierdiker Rebbe, we can hone in on that. Rabbi Serebryanski held up a picture of the Mikorot Kodesh. It was my hope today to get on the record reading some of these documents from the Mikorot Kodesh. The Frierdiker Rebbe set up times for people to teach Torah, to bake matzah, to perform brit milah, to enforce kashrut, and things like this, and many other things. Keeping schools open on Sunday, not having high school students have to take tests on Shabbos, things like that. We don't have time for all of this, but here's an important letter from Eila Ezkara by Hillel Zeitlin, whose dates are 1871, 1942. And if I have time, I'll read a little bit of that. Here's a picture of the Karl Synagogue, where Rav Gluskin ended up being a rabbi. Later, after Minsk, 2 letters of rabbinic ordination signed by Rav Gluskin, with all your soul and might, to Rav Shalom Chaim Perlo, who Rabbi Serebryanski mentioned, living in Brahman, son of the Mishmeret Shalom of Kodunov in Ner Yisrael. There's the picture of that. It's in our book, hopefully. Now, here's a picture of the father-in-law of Rav Gluskin, Menachem Mendel Gluskin, and his father was Eliezer Gluskin, Eliezer Rabinovich. His father was Rabbi Yucham Yehudah Lieb Perlman. A whole book has been written on him and many other things. And he was known as the Gadol of Minsk. He wrote a work called Ur Gadol and many other things. He wrote Hashkamot to a Haggadah. We don't have a time today to go into it all. And I'm going to fly because we're really, time is of the essence. I'm going to skip the maps and the statistical populations. Here's a picture of Kayla Liba Gluskin Helfgott, my great-grandmother's kever. Let's get a good close-up of that. That is in the Rosedale Synagogue, I think in Baltimore. Here's a picture of Miriam Gluskin Helfgott and her father, Rabbi Yosef Yitzchok Helfgott. To make a long story short, to pick up on Rabbi Serebryanski's theme of Rav Menachem Mendel Gluskin being an optimist and seeing the glass as half full, you should know that my grandmother, who was born a Gluskin, she was in a horrible car crash in 1949. She lost her husband, Binyamin Sachs. My middle name is Binyamin. That's where my middle name comes from. And she always saw the glass as half full. The doctor said she'd never walk again. She ended up walking with canes. She had a hip replaced, a knee replaced, a shoulder replaced, teeth replaced, terrible problems from the accident. And she was always an optimist, and I visited her a lot, thousands of hours. And in fact, she remembered her uncle very well, Rav Menachem Mendel Gluskin. She remembers on Pesach, he'd be davening in a kittel, and at the Pesach Seder in a kittel, and at Sukkot, they would walk to his sukkah, and all sorts of little anecdotes. My grandmother Miriam was such an optimist. And I now don't have time to talk too much about Miriam, Zachron Lebracha, but I'm going to go to my mother. My mother took care of my grandmother so devotedly. Like Rabbi Tarfon, she got on her hands and knees every night and put on my grandmother's socks and slippers so her feet would not get cold. My mother made sure everything was lined up, from her favorite foods at 7 Mile Lane to making sure she had enough pillows. And she was a Tillim Sager. And not only was she a Tillim Sager and a learned woman, she would make her own Tachinas prayers in Yiddish, some of which I have and have to find in my boxes. She would write prayers in Yiddish that were like very creative and very metaphorically beautiful. And my grandmother Miriam wrote these prayers. My mother made sure she had a stock of Mikorot Gedolot. She intuited the Rashi, the Seforno, the Malbim. She knew it by heart because Rabbi Yosef Yitzchok Gluskin gave her a tutor. This was before Beis Yaakov. So a tutor came to the house, a Malamed, and she learned Mishnayos, and she learned how to read the Serenina and the Siddur and Pirkei Avot and some basic texts, and also Mikorot Gedolot. Some very illustrious ancestors. Dr. Lieberman was a brother-in-law of Rav Gluskin. You see here you have that Lieberman was the nephew of the Chazon Ish, which there's a photo, a painting over there that my grandmother gave me from Lieberman, who was roomed with the Chazon Ish in Minsk. Here you see Rabbi Chaim Ozer Grudinsky wrote Hashkama for the Chazon Ish Aliyah in Bnei Brak and so forth. Here's a picture of the Brisker Rav, who was present at the wedding of, I believe, Gittel Gluskina. She told me that in Givatayim in an interview. And you see the Chavetz Chaim there, who Gittel met and actually picked flowers from her own garden. A little piece of plot of land, no bigger than a sandbox. She grew some flowers and gave it to the Chavetz Chaim. A picture of Dr. Aryeh Vilsker. I only aspire to listen to his monologues. One of the greatest librarians that's ever lived. You can read more about that in our book. He discovered a feud of Rabbi Yehudah HaLevy on the murder of Spanish Jewry. I include this in my video with Rabbi Weisblum on Rabbi Yehudah HaLevy. You can read that and hear me reading that in my broken Hebrew on the video of Rabbi Yehudah HaLevy. A picture of the Saltykov Library where Dr. Vilsker worked. Esther Gluskin was a member of Shomer HaTzir, sent to the Gulag. And there's so much here that we can recount. You'll see in the book as well, a picture of my mother. My mother devotedly attended to her grandmother, to her mother Miriam, and not only that, she taught English literature at an all-girls school. I'm going to read you some of the chapter, not all, we don't have time for all, about the woman who you're named after, my mother's Ruth. And like the biblical Ruth S. Levy manifested virtues of faith in the Hashem, obedience to his will, courage, humility, strength of character, virtue, excellence, hard work, diligence, conscientiousness and perseverance, kindness, moral and intellectual integrity. My mother's intellect was off the charts. She went to Bryn Mawr College at the age of 14, very rare. She went at 14 because she was so precocious. And to pass a BA at Bryn Mawr, she had to pass an exam in French. She read Le Chanson de Roland and La Fontaine's Les Fables, a little story of Le Cigale and for me. Translated it, Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, Kritik des reinen Vernunft, and her teacher Gregory Nagard and Richard Lattimore made her translate a dialogue of Plato. Like Esther, who also has a whole section of the Tanakh named after her, Ruth is a strong woman who ensures the continuance of her people and makes hard decisions in tough times, always acting out of magnanimous greatness of soul and Gimilut Chasadim. And Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, "Blessed be he, Hashem, who has not left off his kindness from the living and from the dead." As Maimonides puts it, the concept of chesed includes two notions, one of them consisting in the exercise of beneficence toward one who deserves it, but in a greater measure than he who does not deserve it. And Chabad is notorious for, the Beit HaMikdash was destroyed because of Sinat Hinam. The Lubavitcher Rebbe, writing to Eli Wiesel, says, Avas Hinam, and showering beneficence upon people and bringing them closer to Hashem. And in the most cases, the prophetic books use the word Hesed in the sense of practicing beneficence toward one who has no right at all to claim this. Guide for the Perplexed. Ruth's mode is not only the first, but second to practice benevolence toward people who even have no claim on it. Ruth S. Levy did this in countless ways, acting selflessly, sacrificing for others. Ruth, in spite of dissuasion of Naomi, accompanied her mother-in-law to Bethlehem and cast in her lot with her people of Yehudah. Despite the reversal of fortune, how she had been raised as a Moabite princess, and due to misfortune became destitute, as was the case with Ruth Levy. She lost her father. Her father was in the antique business and then later became a radiologist, and they had to sell all the antiques for pittance. Dr. Robert Levy, a successful, brilliant physician and scientist, became Ruth's Goel, and like Boaz, eventually named their male offspring David, whose middle name is Benjamin after his maternal grandfather killed in the car accident, thereby redeeming the estate like the biblical Boaz. Although the biblical text states 2 interceding generations between Boaz and David, our family history proceeds over Oved and Ishai right to David, so that the interest in the genealogy of David is thought to indicate a date when David has become part of the history of Israel. The difference in biblical book of Ruth and Ruth S. Levy is that Ruth S. Levy was no Moabitess, and in fact stems from venerable bloodline of rabbinic dynasties of Chabad, Shklov, and Shlonim. So we hope that my daughter Ruth Levy will carry on in the footsteps of Ruth S. Levy, growing in Torah to reach the chuppah and do acts of love and kindness, and understand that you stem from Reinige Chashida Idin von Chasidim Kadashim Shtam. Ruth's zenith was reflected in her aristocratic bearing, which was evident in her dress and her mannerisms and continued into her final days, even when she could hardly communicate due to lung cancer. Ruth grew up without a father most of her life because her father was killed in a car crash. Ruth was precocious, as I went to Bryn Mawr. The gift Ruth bestowed on her family was the lesson she gave them in Kud, Kavod, Av, V'aim. Ruth treated her parents and her in-laws like royalty. They were serving them, caring for them, waiting on them hand in hand, fulfilling the mitzvah of Kavod et Avicha V'imach. Ruth made sure that Miriam had all her needs and comforts. In North Oaks retirement community, where Rabbi Oberstein gave shirim, and Ruth brought kosher dainties from afar for her mother, who liked rogala, simis, gefilte fish, and kreplach. Ruth made herself learned from her mother Miriam, and they discussed Torah. Miriam also liked bagels and lox, but the salt was not so good for her. The family secret, however, was not in culinary, as handed down from Kayla Liba Gluskin, who made sweet candies out of radishes. Radishes are bitter. Rav Yehudah HaNasi in Beit Sharim and Sapori always had radishes on the table. It was an incredible delicacy in those times. And Kayla Liba, my great-grandmother, would take these bitter things and somehow smash them and put honey in them and make candies out of them, turning the bitter into sweet. That Miriam went through a lot of bitterness. She was in a car accident. She was the bionic woman with her hip, knee, and shoulder replaced. When discussing the Eshet Chayil, Shlomo Melech writes, Ozva Adar Levusha, V'tishak Liyom Acharon. Strength and majesty are her raiment, and she joyfully awaits the last days. Ozva Adar, strength and majesty are accurate descriptions for the dignified levaya of Ruth, your grandmother. The funeral home was packed. Over 2,000 people in attendance, as I fervently served on the lowest rung of the totem pole at Ner Yisrael High School as an English teacher and a librarian. Rabbi Yaakov Shukman, then the principal, the Mahalet, brought the whole yeshiva to Levinson's down the street of Yeshiva Lane. In the Shiva house at 6248 Woodcrest Avenue, a Sefer Torah was provided by Rabbi David Katz, from which David laned during Shiva on Monday and Thursday. I remember it was Ki Tisa. And a minion for Shacharit and Chanmari we never missed. At the Levaya, David wanted to give a hesped about the illustrious rabbinic stock and history from which Ruth and Miriam stemmed, but he did not do so, as is the custom of not giving a hesped on Rosh Chodesh, and is the custom of Chabad Lubavitch. However, the pasuk that illustrates Ruth the most is Picha Patcha B'Chochma, the Torah Chesed. Ruth was full of Chochma and Bina, both practical and more theoretical, whether it be recognizing a conflict of an interest of a lawyer who was selling a field and being the buyer and the seller. Ruth's BA, as I mentioned, was very, very high standards. However, Ruth's knowledge of secular literature was largely self-taught, continued through her life as an autodidact, which she explored in works of Hebrew literature and religious Zionism. You can read the chapter in the book. She was an avid reader of Israeli fiction, Brenner, Agnon, Bialik, Chernikovsky, and many others, Israeli politics, Israeli archaeology, all sorts of things. Ruth planned for the future of the well-being of her children and thus did not fear the snowy days of the future because all of her household was dressed in royalty. Lo tirash leveita mishela kikol veita levusha shanim. Ruth planned for the future financially, and her children and grandchildren investing and sacrificing everything for them. Oz v'hadar levusha v'tischok liyom hakaron. May we find joy in emulating her special, graceful, and magnificent ways, and may we soon be zoche to merit the fulfillment az yimloch shok pinu v'lashonenu rina. Then our mouths will be filled with laughter and our tongue with glad song. Ruth, along with Robert, my father, played the piano and made sure her 3 children did receive music lessons. We will never forget Ruth's encouragement of all her children's educational pursuits. My mother, and I want you to know this very well, did not care what you scored on a quiz or test. It was what you had learned. Did you ask a good question that transformed you intellectually, morally, and spiritually? Although we all did excellent in school, and my 2 other sisters went to Ivy League schools, we had no pressure whatsoever. My mother conveyed to us a love of learning, what in Hebrew is called Torah Lishma. And she inherited that sense of Torah Lishma from her illustrious rabbinic heritage. So much more could be said. My mother gave greatly to charities, not just Jewish and secular, but to Israeli charities in particular, including Leket Israel, Meir Panim, those help feed people who don't have enough to eat in Israel, and Hadassah Hospital and Shari Tzedek Hospital in Israel, and other charities. You can research that in our book. So this genealogical quest and research really was begun by my mother. She put an ad in the Allgemeiner for her Gluskin cousins, and somebody named Debbie from Beersheba answered her and put her, my grandmother Miriam, in touch with Rabbi Serebryanski's grandfather, Rabbi Zalman Serebryansky, who wrote Miriam a letter or 2 letters in Yiddish. And that person was Debbie Nussbaum that answered the Allgemeiner request. In later years, Ruth pursued much intellectual exploration in Zionist thought. She had the complete works of Chaim Weitzman, read Menachem Begin's White Nights, and many other things you can read in the book, and had great Chibat Zion illustrated in the verse, Ani Ma'arev v'libi Mizrach. That's the Yehudah HaLevy video we did on Rabbi Weisblum's channel that I hope you'll watch, because Dr. R.A. Vilsker's research of Yehudah HaLevy's poems are brought down there. So there's so much here, and we don't have time to mention it all. I hope you'll take a look at the book and the chapter on your namesake, Ruth. Names are very significant. Moshe killed the taskmaster with the Yud-Kei Vav-Kei. The Kohen Gadol recites the Yud-Kei Vav-Kei and the Kaddish Kaddashim on Yom Kippur. In the Kel Malei Rachamim, we refer to shining names in Gan Eden. All names have meanings, as you know. Your name, Ruth, means full of compassion, mercy. And I hope you'll walk in the ways of my mother, who was filled with that as well. My mother never got angry, never spoke Lashon Hara. She was a tzedekit and had intellectual merit of the highest caliber. She encouraged me to fulfill the mission in Peah 1. These are the precepts that have no prescribed measure, the corner of the field for the poor, and she gave greatly to charities. The first fruit offering, Bikurim, in the Parsha Ki Tavo, which is one of the parshiot I like to learn. Not the courses, but the opening first three aliyot, which Ruth heard David laying on Shabbos. My mother came to shul in Baltimore and heard me laying that parsha, as well as Pinchas and a number of other ones, Haftorah, Yitro, etc. This Mishnah is recapitulated in Talmud Bavli Shabbos 2027a, which Ruth also fulfilled as best possible. Ruth's life is an example of self-sacrifice for others, and her presence blessed all who circulated in her orbit. May Ruth's memory be for a blessing and her soul caught up in the bundle of life, a shining name in Gan Eden. And this is who you're named after, Ruth, my mother. Just so we go a little bit into the Twilight Zone area, when I interviewed Gidol Gluskina in Givatayim, I asked her why, with the coincidence that the yard site of her father, Rav Gluskin, was the fifth of Kislev, I think, and her mother, Fredo Rabinovich Gluskin, the fifth of Kislev. They said their souls were so caught up with one another in the higher heavens. There are 7 names for the higher heavens in the Masechet Hagiga. And if you look at Ha'arya Kodesh, and he talks about the importance of research of knowing one's soul ancestry, he actually relates it to the 7 heavens. And I don't have time to put that on the docket, but everything connects, everything is illuminated, and I hope that you will go forth as an illuminated example of a Kiddush Hashem for your illustrious ancestors that we have tried to share with you, just the tip of the iceberg of some of their gadlus in Torah, in Bein Adam Lechavaro, and in Ruchnius. And I thank Rabbi Weisblum and Rabbi Serebryanski so much for making this video possible. Thank you.